The first light, over Essex on the morning of June 7, 1940, fell on a row of Supermarine Spitfires parked at RAF Hornchurch. Two of them stood at the head of the line, wingtip to wingtip, aluminum skins cold from the night. To any eye on the ground, they were the same aircraft. Same airframe. Same Merlin engine. Same 8 Browning machine guns bolted into the same wings. Same pilots, in most cases, who had been flying them for the past 3 weeks, over the beaches of northern France. They were not the same aircraft. One of them, in the ordinary measurement of what a Spitfire could do in the summer of 1940, needed 320 yards to lift off the grass, 11 minutes and 8 seconds to reach 20,000 feet, and could climb no higher than 32,000. The other one, 3 weeks earlier, had climbed to 20,000 feet in 7 minutes and 42 seconds. Its ceiling was 39,000. It had lifted off in 225 yards. The pilots at Hornchurch on the morning of June 7th did not yet know why. The men who did know were 300 miles across the Atlantic, in a factory in Connecticut, where an engineer named Frank Walker Caldwell had spent the last 22 years building a piece of aluminum that would, in the 8 weeks between that June morning and the middle of August, decide whether the Royal Air Force lived or died. This is the story of that piece of aluminum. It is the story of how one American engineer, dismissed by his own army as building something too complex for combat, put the propeller on the Spitfires that saved Britain. It is the story of a Sunday telephone call that broke every rule in the Royal Air Force, and of the 1,200 fighters that were converted, one by one, in blacked-out hangars through the shortest summer nights of the war. And it is the story of what happens when a system. In the operations hut at Hornchurch, that morning, a squadron leader stood at the window and watched his ground crew move between the aircraft. His name was Desmond Cook. He commanded No. 65 Squadron. 3 days earlier, on June 4th, the last of the small ships had returned from Dunkirk, and the last of the surviving pilots of the British Expeditionary Force had come home across the Channel. The men who came back were not the men who had gone. They spoke less at breakfast. They flew with the calm of pilots who had seen the thing they most feared, and now knew its exact shape. Cook understood what they had learned. He had learned it himself, in the sky above Calais and Boulogne, watching Messerschmitt 109s peel upward from beneath his formation, and simply keep climbing, higher and higher, until they became specks in the light. His Spitfires could not follow. They could climb, yes, but they could not climb like that. Above 15,000 feet the German fighters climbed away at will, and the Spitfire pilots below them held the throttle open and prayed for altitude that would not come. The margin was more than 3 minutes. 3 minutes to reach 20,000 feet. That was the deficit. And in the arithmetic of interception, 3 minutes was the distance between meeting the bombers over the Channel and finding them already above London. Cook was a veteran officer who dealt in numbers. He knew where the deficit lived. It lived inside 3 blades of laminated wood bolted to the nose of every Spitfire and Hurricane in fighter command, the de Havilland 2-pitch propeller. It offered a pilot only 2 settings: fine pitch for takeoff, coarse pitch for cruise. Nothing in between. When a Merlin engine climbed hard through the altitudes of combat, the propeller could not follow the changing air. Power drained away. The engine screamed at the wrong revolutions. The blades bit at the wrong angle. A large portion of the horsepower Rolls-Royce had built into the Merlin bled off, into noise and heat and useless motion. Somewhere across the Atlantic, that problem had already been solved. It had been solved 7 years ago. It had been solved by a man Cook had never met, in a factory Cook had never seen, in a country that would not, for another 18 months, be at war. 7 years earlier, on a gray February morning in 1933, a 43-year-old engineer named Frank Walker Caldwell stood inside the test facility of the Hamilton Standard Propeller Corporation in East Hartford, Connecticut. Wire-rimmed glasses. a clipboard against his hip. The methodical bearing of a man who had spent 25 years learning to trust numbers over opinions. Behind him, mounted on a steel stand, and roped down, with cable, a 3-bladed aluminum propeller spun at 2,400 revolutions per minute. It was unlike any propeller in aviation. As it turned, the blades themselves rotated slowly on their own axes, changing angle while the shaft spun. A small hydraulic governor, no larger than a coffee tin, regulated the pitch. Oil pressure from the engine did the work. The idea was old. Caldwell had chased it since 1918, since the days when he served as the United States government's chief propeller engineer at McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio. In every generation of aviation, one flight condition demanded a different propeller than another. A fine pitch, biting the air in small quick slices, gave a pilot the thrust to lift off. A coarse pitch, biting deep, gave him speed at altitude. But a propeller made of wood, cast in one shape, could only do one thing. Choose one flight regime. Sacrifice all others. Caldwell had built a propeller that could change its mind. The engineering was elegant in its simplicity. During takeoff, when the engine strained for power, oil pressure drove a piston that rotated the blades toward fine pitch. The engine could then reach its full revolutions and translate every horsepower into thrust. At cruise altitude, the same piston shifted the blades toward coarse pitch, and the same engine, at the same revolutions, could pull the aircraft faster and farther on less fuel. And if an engine failed entirely, the pilot could feather the blade's edge onto the wind, eliminating the drag that would otherwise pull a wounded aircraft into a spin. But numbers meant nothing to the aviation industry of 1933. They already knew what a propeller was. That February, a telephone call from Seattle had made the problem concrete. On the runways of Boeing Field, the Boeing Model 247, the most advanced airliner in the world, sat waiting for a customer that was losing patience. The 247 was an all-metal twin-engine machine that should have transformed American air travel. Faster than anything in the sky. Retractable landing gear. Cantilevered wings. But it could not cross the Rocky Mountains. Weighed down by a wooden propeller optimized for cruise, the 247 struggled at altitude. Every mountain west of Denver rose higher than the aircraft could comfortably climb. United Airlines had ordered 60 of them. The order was worth the survival of a company. And the aircraft, in the plain fact of its aerodynamics, could not fly the routes it had been sold to fly. Caldwell believed his propeller could solve it. He believed it, with the calm certainty of a man who had spent his career being proven right by data long, after being dismissed by opinion. But belief, in that industry in that decade, was cheap. Across the country, the conventional wisdom moved, from hangar to hangar, with the weight of gospel. Variable pitch propellers were a solution looking for a problem. Too heavy. Too complex. Too many precision moving parts operating in an environment where oil froze at altitude and vibration shook loose the tightest bolt. And in the autumn of 1932, the skepticism had taken official form. At Wright Field in Dayton, the Army Air Corps' primary engineering center, the engineering division had raised formal objections to hydraulic propeller designs. The propeller was too complex. The oil could freeze. The governor could jam. And in an industry that had learned to fly, with wooden blades cut to a single shape, the men who ran that industry were not eager to relearn what they already knew. Caldwell did not answer them publicly. He had learned, over a career, that opinions did not respond to opinions. Only numbers responded to opinions. And so he went back to the test stand, and he went back to his engineers, and he prepared for the flight that would either save Hamilton's Standard or end it. The pilot was Eddie Allen, 37 years old. A former Navy aviator, with a reputation for ice-water composure and a career-long habit of surviving what should have killed him. He would take the modified Boeing 247 out of Denver, up over the Continental Divide, into the very airspace, where the fixed-pitch aircraft had struggled. If Allen made it, Hamilton's standard would live. Caldwell did not fly with him. Engineers did not fly test flights in 1933. He waited by a telephone in Connecticut. He waited while Allen climbed the modified 247 out of Denver, past 6,000 feet, past 8,000, past 10. He waited while the twin-engine airliner crossed the Continental Divide, as if it were a low ridge in Kansas. He waited while Allen leveled off high, over Colorado and turned west. The telegram arrived that evening. Its language was not the language of an aviation man in doubt. Constant speed propeller exceeds all performance claims. Caldwell folded the paper and set it on his desk. In the same year, in a country he had never visited, the National Socialist German Workers' Party seized the government of Germany. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff was drafting doctrine for a war in the Pacific. Aviation was no longer only about airliners. The telephone rang again. A voice identified itself as Captain John Towers of the United States Navy Department, Bureau of Aeronautics. They wanted to talk about fighters. Fighters that could climb higher than anything a foreign power was building. Bombers that could fly beyond the reach of any interceptor an enemy could raise against them. Caldwell listened. He did not yet know that the propeller he had spent 15 years perfecting would decide the outcome of a war that had not yet begun. He did not yet know that in a factory at Hatfield, England. He did not yet know that 7 years later, on a June morning in 1940, a squadron leader named Desmond Cook would stand at a window at RAF Hornchurch and understand, with the terrible clarity of a man about to send young men to die, that the propeller Caldwell had built in Connecticut was the only thing standing between his pilots and annihilation. He did not yet know how far his numbers would travel. But he knew, that evening in East Hartford, that the industry had stopped laughing. The Collier Trophy was awarded to Hamilton's Standard on May 29, 1934. The National Aeronautic Association, the highest civil aviation authority in the United States, cited particular credit to Frank W. Caldwell, chief engineer, for the development and demonstration of a controllable pitch propeller now in general use. Roosevelt received him at the White House the following month. There is a photograph. The engineer in a dark suit, wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. The president seated at his desk, one hand extended. Caldwell was 45 years old. He had been proven right by the highest authority the American aviation establishment could offer. He had shaken the hand of the President of the United States. His picture had appeared in every technical journal, from Boston to San Diego. And the United States Army Air Corps still did not want his propeller. The resistance was not stupid. It was, in its way, professional. At Wright Field, the officers of the Fighter Projects Office spoke for a generation of Army pilots, when they laid out the problem in language every combat aviator understood. What happens when that hydraulic system fails over enemy territory? When the oil pressure drops? When the governor jams at 30,000 feet in air, that is 60 degrees below zero? A fixed-pitch propeller does not break down. There is nothing in a fixed-pitch propeller to break. They were not wrong. Combat aircraft did not fail in laboratories. They failed in the sky, over Belgium, over the North Sea, over deserts where sand ate into every moving part. Every component added to an aircraft was one more thing that could fail. And Caldwell's propeller was not one component. It was 47 precision-machined components, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, all of them working together at 2,400 revolutions per minute in a hostile environment. Caldwell did not argue. He built a test facility. Working 18-hour days at East Hartford, he invented what became known in the industry as the World Test, a fixed stand-on, which a propeller could be spun to destruction, while instruments measured every stress, every vibration, every failure mode that mattered. He subjected his propellers to loads well beyond any combat aircraft would ever inflict on them. He froze them. He heated them. He contaminated their hydraulic fluid with metal filings to simulate the punishment of a working military airfield. He ran governors continuously for hundreds of hours at temperatures no combat pilot would ever see. And when the propellers survived, he ran them again. By the middle of the decade, the constant speed propeller was becoming standard on new American aircraft designs. The commercial airliners went first. Then the trainers. Then, slowly, at first over the objections of officers, who trusted what they had trained on, the combat aircraft. The men who would fly Caldwell's propellers into battle were, in 1934, still boys in high school in Ohio, and Oklahoma and Texas. The war they would fight had not yet been named. Across the Atlantic, that war was being prepared. By 1935, the Luftwaffe had reconstituted itself in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. By 1937, German factories were producing the Messerschmitt Bf-109 in serial numbers. The Bf-109 carried, from the beginning, a variable pitch propeller. On the E model, that flew in 1940, the pitch was controlled by an electric motor, adjusted by a thumb switch on the throttle, allowing the German pilot to optimize his thrust across every altitude at which a battle might be fought. It was not automatic. It required attention. But it worked. In Britain, no such propeller existed on operational fighters at scale. The Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, the two aircraft on which the survival of the United Kingdom would depend, entered service carrying the de Havilland two-pitch propeller. A wooden blade with two settings. Fine pitch for takeoff. Coarse pitch for cruise. The two settings were not adjusted automatically. They were changed by the pilot, once, at the beginning of the climb, and once more at the top. Between those two positions there was nothing. A Spitfire climbing through 18,000 feet was flying a compromise. So was a Spitfire flying at 9. There was one exception. In late 1939, a small experimental batch of Spitfires had rolled off the Supermarine line carrying a different propeller. It was built by a British company called Rotor, a joint venture of Rolls-Royce and Bristol formed in 1937. The Rotor was a constant speed unit built on the same fundamental principles Frank Caldwell had proven at Hamilton Standards 6 years earlier. It automatically adjusted blade pitch to match engine revolutions. It was, in every measurable way, the same solution. Only a handful of Spitfires received it. One of them was serial N3180, delivered to No. 54 Squadron at RAF Hornchurch. On the morning of May 23, 1940, a 22-year-old New Zealander named Al Deer lifted N3180 off the grass at Hornchurch and flew across the channel to support the evacuation from Dunkirk. That day, over the beaches of northern France, Deer shot down a Messerschmitt Bf-109 in air-to-air combat. He would later say, in the plain understatement of men who fly small aircraft against large odds, that the Spitfire had felt right that day. It had climbed with the German. It had held its altitude. It had not fallen away beneath him. Deer did not know, when he landed, that he had flown one of the few Spitfires in the entire Royal Air Force that carried a constant speed propeller. The pilots on either side of him on the concrete apron flew Spitfires that did not. The technology had reached Britain. It had reached Britain months before the war. It had reached Britain, and Britain had done nothing at scale with it. The reason was not incompetence. It was the ordinary catastrophe of large institutions. The Rotor required a specially modified Merlin engine. Rolls-Royce was already overwhelmed producing standard Merlins for a fighter force that could not be expanded fast enough. The Air Ministry was reluctant to disrupt a production line that was, at last, delivering aircraft in the numbers Fighter Command needed. And so the technology sat in a small quiet corner of the war, on N3180 and a few dozen others, while the rest of the Royal Air Force flew into combat with a propeller from 1936. Over Dunkirk, the arithmetic of that decision was written into the sky. Fighter Command sent squadron after squadron across the channel to cover the evacuation. Aircraft would rise from the Kentish airfields at dawn. Fewer would return. Above 15,000 feet, the Messerschmitt 109 climbed away at will. Squadron reports came in, with the same sentence, phrased in 100 different accents, from 100 different pilots. We could not follow. They climbed away. Fighter Command was losing 3 minutes on the climb to combat altitude. 3 minutes, in the mathematics of interception, was the difference between meeting a bomber over the channel and losing it into cloud. 3 minutes was the difference between a pilot who came home and a pilot who did not. At the Air Ministry, the loss reports piled up on desks. Officials read them and signed them and moved them into other piles. The bureaucracy that had commissioned the Spitfire and the Hurricane and had, in ordinary competent fashion, delivered them to squadrons across Fighter Command was slow to see that it had delivered them incomplete. The man who saw it first was not at the Air Ministry. He was at RAF Hornchurch. He commanded No. 65 Squadron. He had just returned from Dunkirk. His name was Desmond Cook. On Sunday, June 9, 1940, an officer at Hornchurch, acting under Cook's authority, placed a direct telephone call to the de Havilland Propeller Works at Hatfield. According to the records held by the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, the officer who lifted the receiver may have been Flight Lieutenant McGrath of 65 Squadron. The archives are not certain. What is certain is that the call bypassed every proper channel in the Royal Air Force. It bypassed the Air Ministry. It bypassed Fighter Command headquarters. It bypassed Cook's own group commander. It was, in the strict sense of the regulations Cook had spent his career upholding, unauthorized. The question they asked was simple. Could the two-pitch de Havilland propellers already fitted to every Spitfire in Fighter Command be converted, in the field, to constant speed operation? The answer that came back down the line was one word. Yes. According to some accounts, de Havilland had already begun preparing conversion parts in anticipation of this call. Whether or not that story is fully accurate, what is certain is that the company moved with speed no wartime bureaucracy could have matched. 4 days later, an engineering team from de Havilland, accompanied by their test pilot Eric Lane Burslam, arrived at RAF Hornchurch with a lorry full of parts. On the night of June 14, 1940, working through the darkness in a hangar smelling of aviation fuel and cold metal, they removed the two-pitched propeller from one Spitfire of No. 65 Squadron. They installed a new hub. They ran hydraulic lines to a governor no larger than a coffee tin. They connected the governor to the Merlin engine's oil supply. They calibrated the pitch range. They tested the mechanism on the ground. And then, in the gray dawn of June 15th, they wheeled the modified Spitfire out onto the grass at Hornchurch, and squadron leader Desmond Cook walked out to fly it. He was a squadron leader in the Royal Air Force. He was a veteran of France and Dunkirk. He had watched too many young men climb into aircraft that could not, in the honest measurement of their performance, do what he was asking them to do. He climbed into the cockpit. He closed the canopy. He advanced the throttle. The Merlin engine roared to full power. The propeller, no longer locked in two positions, adjusted continuously to match the engine's revolutions. The Spitfire lifted off the grass in 225 yards. His previous Spitfire had needed 320. Cook pointed the nose at the sky and began to climb. At 5,000 feet, the propeller adjusted. At 10,000 feet, it adjusted again. At 15,000 feet, the altitude at which he had watched Messerschmitts climb away from him over Dunkirk, the Spitfire was still accelerating upward, the engine holding its revolutions steady, the blades finding their optimum bite in air that grew thinner with every second. 20,000 feet. 7 minutes. 42 seconds. His previous Spitfire had needed 11 minutes and 8 seconds. He kept climbing. 25,000. 30,000. His breath began to frost inside the cockpit. At 39,000 feet, in air so thin he could feel the aircraft laboring at the edge of its physics, the Spitfire finally reached its ceiling. The old ceiling had been 32,000 feet. Cook turned the aircraft and began his descent toward Hornchurch. On the way down, he had time to understand what he had just measured. He had climbed to combat altitude nearly 4 minutes faster. He could operate 7,000 feet higher than any Spitfire pilot in fighter command. He had matched, in a single field conversion, everything the Messerschmitt Bf 109 had ever done to his squadron. His pilots, at that moment, were flying aircraft that could not do this. His pilots would go up tomorrow, and the day after, and every day, until this conversion reached them, in aircraft that would climb 3 minutes slower than the one he had just flown. Fighter Command needed 1,200 of these conversions. The Luftwaffe was massing across the channel, waiting for the order to begin. Cook landed the Spitfire. He walked to the operations building. He picked up the telephone. The message from Hornchurch on the evening of June 15, 1940, moved through Fighter Command, with the speed of a report that no one in the receiving chain wanted to be the last to pass along. By June 17, the results of the Hornchurch test flight and Cook's recommendations were on the desks of the Air Ministry. By June 22, they had reached the desk of a man who could act on them, without waiting for a committee to convene. His name was Lord Beaverbrook. He was 61 years old, a Canadian-born newspaper proprietor, whom Winston Churchill had appointed in May as Minister of Aircraft Production. Beaverbrook was not an aviation man. He was a man who understood that the ordinary machinery of British government moved at the pace of a war that had already been lost. He had spent the 6 weeks since his appointment breaking committees, bypassing procedures, and answering to almost no one except the Prime Minister. On June 22, he read the Hornchurch report. Almost immediately, he issued the order. Every Spitfire, every Hurricane, every Defiant in Fighter Command would be converted to constant speed operation. On June 24, engineering parties left the de Havilland Works at Hatfield in lorries, and dispersed across southern and central England. 12 teams, 12 Spitfire stations. Each lorry carried conversion sets and instructions to train the local Royal Air Force fitters as they worked, then move on to the next airfield before the next dawn. At Duxford, at Biggin Hill, the fitters watched, then joined in, then took over. The first conversion at each station took a full working day. The second took less. By the 5th Spitfire on any airfield, the local ground crew could complete the modification without help. A squadron could be converted in 10 days, without ever losing more than a quarter of its aircraft at any one time. The Royal Air Force could not stop flying. The Battle of Britain would begin on July 10, whether Fighter Command was ready or not. And so the conversions happened at night. In hangars lit by shaded work lights that would not show through blackout curtains. In the small hours, when the aircraft were down, and the pilots were asleep, and the coolant in the Merlin engines had gone cold. Fitters worked in shifts, sleeping 4 hours between shifts, waking in the dark to remove another propeller hub, and install another governor, and calibrate another pitch range. The Spitfires went into the hangars at midnight, and came out at dawn, and the pilots, who climbed into them at 5 o'clock in the morning, did not always know, until they advanced the throttle for takeoff, that the aircraft they had flown yesterday was no longer the same aircraft. The pilots knew immediately. The takeoff run shortened. The engine held its revolutions where the pilot set them, and did not slide off through the shifting altitudes. Above 15,000 feet, where the Messerschmitts had climbed away from them at Dunkirk, the Spitfires kept climbing. Above 20,000 feet, where they had once labored, they now cruised. Above 30,000 feet, where they had never been at all, they now waited for the German bombers to arrive. On July 10, the Luftwaffe began the battle that Hermann Göring had promised the Führer would clear the skies of Britain in 3 weeks. The Spitfires that rose to meet them were not the aircraft the Luftwaffe had studied at Dunkirk. The pilots were the same men. The airframes were the same airframes. The engines were the same Merlins. But the propellers were no longer the propellers Luftwaffe intelligence had catalogued. The propellers had come from a factory in Connecticut, by way of a licensing agreement, with a British company at Hatfield, by way of a squadron leader at RAF Hornchurch, who had picked up a telephone on a Sunday morning in June, and refused to wait for a committee. By August 2nd, every one of the approximately 300 serviceable Spitfires in Fighter Command carried a constant-speed propeller. The Hurricane conversions continued through the middle of August. On August 16th, 4 days before the day the Royal Air Force would later call the hardest day, the last of the modifications was completed. Fighter Command counted its final total. Approximately 1,050 aircraft converted. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Defiance. Every fighter Britain had. On August 18th, the Luftwaffe launched one of the largest single-day air assaults of the campaign. Roughly 850 German aircraft crossed the Channel, over the course of nearly 1,000 sorties. Airfields across the south of England burned. Radar stations went off the air. Fighter Command scrambled everything it had, and kept scrambling, as new formations appeared behind the ones already being engaged. When the sun went down, the Royal Air Force had lost 68 aircraft in the air and on the ground. 10 of its pilots had been killed. The Luftwaffe had lost 69 aircraft, and the crews of the twin-engine bombers among them were, in most cases, unrecoverable. The hardest day was, in the mathematics, that both sides understood, a British survival. The Luftwaffe had come to break Fighter Command, and Fighter Command had refused to break. There were many reasons for that. Radar. The doubting system. The training of the pilots. The organization of the sector stations. The strategic decisions of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who was 58 years old that summer and who spent the battle in a state of exhausted, methodical calm at Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory. But somewhere in the causes, distributed across 1,000 engagements, and 10,000 climbing turns, and 1,000,000 individual pitch adjustments, that no pilot ever consciously registered, was a propeller. Frank Caldwell was 51 years old in the summer of 1940. He worked in East Hartford, Connecticut. He did not know the name of Desmond Cook. He did not know that the propeller he had helped design in 1933 had, in June of 1940, been the object of a bypass bureaucracy and a Sunday telephone call. He did not know that on the day the hardest day was fought, every fighter in the Royal Air Force carried some version of the technology he had built. He would learn in time. He would learn, most of all, 3 years later, in the autumn of 1943, when the war he had prepared for, without knowing it, turned back on him, with a demand he had not been ready to meet. By 1943, Hamilton Standard was no longer a specialized manufacturer. It was one of the linchpins of American strategic air power. Every B-17 Flying Fortress that took off from an East Anglian airfield carried 4 Hamilton Standard hydromatic propellers. Every B-24 Liberator carried 4. Every P-51 Mustang on every runway, from England to the Marianas, carried a Hamilton Standard, or an Aero Products propeller. Every P-47 Thunderbolt carried a Hamilton Standard, or a Curtiss Electric. Every P-38 Lightning carried Curtiss Electric propellers. The specific manufacturer varied by aircraft, and by contract. The underlying principle, in every case, was the technology Caldwell had proven at Hamilton Standard. The East Hartford factory had grown, from 800 workers to more than 20,000. The order books held contracts for hundreds of thousands of propeller assemblies. Peak monthly output reached into the thousands of complete units. Automobile companies had retooled to build components. Frigidaire. Nash Kelvinator. The country that had once dismissed Caldwell's propeller as too complex for combat now built it on assembly lines that had, 3 years earlier, produced refrigerators. And at that scale, quality began to fail. The men who had assembled the first propellers at East Hartford in 1933 had been machinists, with 15 and 20 years of experience. The men and women who assembled propellers in 1943 were, in many cases, workers who had never touched precision machinery before. They were trained. They were supervised. They were, in the honest measurement of American war production, extraordinary. But they were not machinists, with 20 years of experience. Statistical analysis of failure reports revealed a pattern that Caldwell had spent his career fearing. Propellers assembled during peak production periods failed at higher rates than propellers assembled in the careful era before the war. The failures were rare. But they were happening. And in a bomber crew of 10 men flying at 25,000 feet over Germany, the failure rate did not need to be high to matter. In the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force was bleeding. The daylight bombing campaign against the industrial cities of central Germany was killing American aircrew at rates the American public had not yet been told about. On October 14, 1943, the 2nd Schweinfurt raid dispatched 291 B-17s against the ball-bearing factories that fed the German war machine. 60 of those aircraft did not return. 600 aircrew were dead, wounded, or in German custody by nightfall. The 8th Air Force lost roughly 20% of its striking force in a single afternoon. Most of the aircraft were lost to German fighters. Some were lost to flak. And some, a small number, a number that Frank Caldwell would spend the rest of the war refusing to allow to grow, were lost to mechanical failures that traced back to his propellers. He did what he had always done. He got on an aircraft and went to sea for himself. He arrived in England later that year. He was 54 years old, a chief engineer in a dark civilian suit, standing on the concrete apron of an 8th Air Force base in East Anglia, while a B-17 taxied past him, with a feathered propeller on one engine, and an oiled trail behind it in the wind. He walked into the operations huts. He sat down, with the flight engineers, the men who lived closest to his machinery. He asked them what was failing. They told him. Bluntly. Without ceremony. The men who had flown Schweinfurt did not have the temperament for ceremony. Feathering systems that worked perfectly in training over Kansas failed at altitude over Germany. Hydraulic fluid froze at 30,000 feet. Governors jammed after flak damage. Contaminated oil, cold-soaked at combat altitude, would not flow through the precision passages his engineers had designed on drawing boards in Connecticut. Caldwell listened. He wrote it down. He flew back to East Hartford, and he redesigned the feathering mechanism, and he added redundant hydraulic circuits, and he built in mechanical backups that would hold blade position even if every hydraulic system failed at once. New testing protocols subjected every propeller ship to Army Air Force's procurement to environmental stress that exceeded combat conditions by a wide margin. Temperature cycling from far below zero to well above 100 degrees. Vibration testing at frequencies no aircraft would ever encounter. Deliberate contamination of test units, with metal particles, and ice crystals, and the residues that accumulated on the floor of a working military hangar. By 1944, propeller-related failures had dropped sharply across the 8th Air Force. The feathering mechanism that had killed men in 1943 was, by 1944, routinely saving them. Bomber after bomber came home from Germany with one engine, none of this was one man's work. It never had been. Caldwell had spent his career being celebrated by biographers who did not understand what a factory was. The propeller that flew on the Spitfires of 1940, and the B-17s of 1943, and the P-51s of 1944 was not the work of a single engineer in Connecticut. It was the work of the machinists at East Hartford, the licensing engineers at de Havilland, the fitters who worked, through the nights of June and July 1940 in blacked-out hangars across southern England, the assembly workers at Frigidaire and Nash Kelvinator, the flight engineers, who told Caldwell the truth in East Anglia in the autumn of 1943, and the thousands of other men and women whose names were never recorded in the technical journals. It was the work of a system. That system was what defeated the Luftwaffe. Not a single blade of aluminum. Not a single hydraulic governor the size of a coffee tin. Not a single man in wire-rimmed glasses at a test stand in Connecticut. A system, spanning 2 decades, and 2 continents, and a war that most of the people who built it had not chosen and did not want. The title of this story promises that one engineer's propeller made American fighters 100 miles an hour faster. That is not quite true. No single innovation added 100 miles an hour to any American fighter. The constant speed propeller added something else. It added altitude. It added climb. It added the margin, measured in minutes, and in feet, that let a Spitfire meet a Messerschmitt on equal terms in the summer of 1940, and a P-51 escort a B-17 to Berlin in the winter of 1944, and a bomber pilot come home on 3 engines instead of dying in a spin over the North Sea. Across the compound effects of a decade of improvements, the constant speed unit, the hydromatic feathering system, water methanol injection, higher octane fuel, better superchargers, and the paddle blade propellers, that transformed the P-47 Thunderbolt in the spring of 1944. American fighters at the end of the war flew perhaps 60 to 100 miles an hour faster at altitude than the aircraft that had entered the war in 1941. Some of that was the propeller. Most of it was everything the propeller made possible. Frank Walker Caldwell retired from the United Aircraft Corporation Research Division in 1955. He was 66 years old. The piston era was ending. Jet engines were replacing the machinery he had spent his life perfecting. The propeller he had built was becoming, quietly, a museum piece. He died in 1974, at the age of 85, in the country he had helped to arm, without ever having worn its uniform. Desmond Cook commanded No. 65 Squadron through the Battle of Britain and beyond. Algiers survived the war. He was credited with 17 confirmed victories over enemy aircraft. He was forced down, or bailed out of Spitfires at least 7 times, and he walked away from every crash. He died in 1995, in London, at the age of 77. Hugh Dowding was removed from fighter command in November 1940, 3 months after the Battle of Britain ended. He had won the battle. The politics of victory did not require him afterward. He lived until 1970, and he was, at the end, one of the most honored men in the Royal Air Force. He is buried in the Battle of Britain Chapel at Westminster Abbey. The Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller sits today on display at the New England Air Museum in Windsor Locks, Connecticut. In 1990, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated it an International Historic Mechanical Engineering Landmark. There is a small plaque. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It is 3 blades of aluminum, mounted on a stand, no longer turning. It looks, in the still air of the museum, like a thing that has always been there. Like a shape that could never have been otherwise. It was otherwise. For a long time, it was otherwise. It was otherwise in 1933, when the American aviation establishment was slow to trust it. It was otherwise in 1939, when the Royal Air Force went to war with the propeller of 1936. It was otherwise on the evening of Dunkirk, when the pilots of fighter commands sat in their operations huts and understood that they could not climb with the enemy. It was otherwise until a squadron leader at RAF Hornchurch picked up a telephone on a Sunday morning in June of 1940 and asked a single question and received a single answer. Yes.